a real incident that occurred in a hospital in the eastern region. At that time, Natasha had just started working as a new nurse at that hospital before she became a key witness, which was the cause of all the eerie stories hidden within that hospital. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. This story goes back to around the year 2009. At that time, Natasha had the opportunity to start working as a nurse at a central hospital in the eastern region. She was stationed in the special internal medicine department, where most of the patients were bedridden elderly individuals who needed a lot of assistance. Until one evening, around a little past 7 p.m., Natasha went out to find something to eat in front of the hospital. She had been busy all day and hadn't had time to eat. She walked to the front of the hospital to buy something and ended up with some meatballs to stave off her hunger instead of dinner. Holding the bag of meatballs, Natasha walked back towards the building where she was stationed. When she arrived at the base of the building, she looked for a suitable place to sit and eat the meatballs. She didn't dare to go up and eat in her room because she was still new at the time. Natasha walked around for a while and found a spot at the back of the building. There were marble benches lined up from one building pillar to another, continuing along the walkway in sections. Natasha noticed that there were two areas where the lights were on, so she chose to sit in the second area. The other areas seemed to have burnt out light bulbs. Behind her was an open grassy area, which was very dimly lit, so she could only see shadows. About 10 meters beyond the grassy area was another building, which was the nurse's dormitory where Natasha stayed. While Natasha was sitting and eating her meatballs, she glanced around the area. She noticed that if you walked past two more light poles, there would be a bathroom door at the end of the walkway. However, the area in front of the bathroom was somewhat dark, suggesting that the light bulb there might be broken. Natasha had been eating her meatballs alone for a while when she heard the sound of someone walking from a distance. When she turned to look, she saw two senior nurses from the same department. When the two nurses saw Natasha, she greeted them, saying, "I'll follow you up shortly." The senior nurses waved and nodded in response. Natasha then hurried to finish her meatballs so she could quickly go back up and continue working. When Natasha quickly finished eating her meatballs, she looked for a trash bin to throw away the bag. She saw a trash bin next to the bathroom door. As Natasha got up to throw away the trash, she noticed a dark figure sitting in the area where the light bulb was out, near the bathroom door. She was a bit startled, wondering how long someone had been sitting there. As she stared more closely, she began to make out the figure of a woman in a nurse's uniform, sitting with her head bowed. As she walked closer, it seemed as if the nurse looked up at Natasha. Out of courtesy, Natasha quickly smiled. Observing more closely, Natasha noted that the nurse seemed to be around her age. For some reason, Natasha felt compelled to ask, "Are you okay? Why are you sitting here alone in the dark?" The nurse replied, "No, I'm fine, just taking a quick nap." Hearing this, Natasha quickly apologized, fearing she had disturbed the nurse's rest. At that moment, Natasha noticed that when the nurse looked up at her from about an arm's length away, her eyes seemed like she had just been crying, with tear stains around her eyes. Natasha thought that the nurse must have been crying in secret, so she didn't want to ask anything further. While they were talking, Natasha glanced at the nurse's uniform and saw the name Alice embroidered on it. Natasha went to throw away the trash in front of the bathroom and then walked back. As she passed by the nurse again, Natasha turned and smiled at Alice, who smiled back. Natasha got a clear look at Alice's face once more and saw that she had fair, smooth skin and was very beautiful. After Natasha went back to work for a while, the night went on as usual until the end of her shift. Suddenly, Natasha heard two senior nurses whispering to each other while glancing her way. They seemed to be saying, "You should warn her. You have to warn the new girl." Hearing this, Natasha decided to ask the senior nurses, "Is there something wrong? Did I do something wrong? Please let me know." One of the senior nurses hesitated a bit before saying, "Next time, you can bring your food upstairs to eat. Don't sit and eat down there. It's too dark." Another senior nurse added, Yes, it's dark down there, and there are a lot of mosquitoes. It's better to eat upstairs." Hearing this, Natasha felt relieved, thinking she had done something wrong. She thanked the senior nurses for their concern. In the following days, during her breaks, Natasha often went to sit at the back of the building. She liked it because it was quiet and not many people passed by. Sometimes, she would bring something to read and sit there quietly. One evening, as Natasha was about to start her shift, she sat in the same spot to have her meal before going to work. While eating and reading a book, she was suddenly interrupted when the light in her area started flickering. A mysterious gust of wind blew through, making her look up at the flickering light, which seemed like it was about to go out. Suddenly, the light next to her went out, and the flickering stopped. She returned to her book, but soon felt as if someone was sitting in the dark area beside her. Instinctively, she looked in that direction, but the building pillar obstructed her view. She leaned forward to see if anyone was there and saw a woman in a nurse's uniform, quietly looking at something in her hands. Since it was dark over there, Natasha called out, "You can sit here with me if you'd like." The person turned to look at her and smiled. As Natasha got a clear view, she recognized Alice, the nurse she had seen a few days before. Alice responded sweetly, "No, thank you," and returned to looking at something in her hands. Alice's smile gave Natasha a strange sense of comfort. She moved closer to the pillar that separated them and introduced herself, starting a casual conversation. After chatting for a while, Natasha excused herself to go to work. One day, Natasha was assigned to help the volunteer nursing team in another building. During this time, she met a young doctor named Francis. He was good-looking and very friendly. As Natasha continued helping in that building, she became closer to Dr. Francis because he often started conversations with her. Eventually, Natasha had to return to her own department. Back in her usual building, she became so busy with work that she had little time to go anywhere. One day, a senior nurse brought food for everyone in the department and teased Natasha, saying, "What did you do at that building? Why is Dr. Francis following you here? He hasn't come to this building in a long time. It's strange that he suddenly brought us something." Hearing this, Natasha could only smile. She thought it was just a small act of kindness from Dr. Francis for the help she provided. Around 8 p.m. that same day, Natasha went to buy a box of fried rice and sat in her usual spot under the building. As she sat down at the marble bench and took the food out of the bag, her plastic spoon fell to the ground and rolled under the bench. Natasha crouched down to reach for the spoon, and as she was about to stand up, she noticed Alice standing quietly beside a pillar. Initially startled, Natasha wondered why Alice had come so quietly, but she was also glad to have some company to relieve her stress while eating. Natasha quickly stood up and said to Alice, "Perfect timing, Alice. Wait a moment. Can you watch my stuff for a bit?" She then hurried to the bathroom to wash the spoon. When she returned, she was puzzled by what she saw. Her food box had fallen to the ground, scattering rice everywhere. Looking around, she saw no sign of Alice or anyone else nearby. Natasha sat down to clean up the spilled rice, wondering if Alice had done this and, if so, why she would do such a thing. That day, Natasha went back to work, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept wondering when she had made an enemy and why Alice would do such a thing to her. Natasha's distracted demeanor caught the attention of the senior nurses in the ward, who asked, "Natasha, is something wrong? You don't look well." Not wanting to worry everyone over something seemingly minor, she replied that she was fine. In the following days, Natasha avoided eating in that spot because she didn't want to encounter Alice. As her emotions settled, she began to rationalize that perhaps Alice found her presence annoying. Maybe Alice preferred to be alone in that spot and didn't like being disturbed. Natasha thought that if she simply stayed away from that area, everything would be resolved and she would feel more at ease. One late morning, Dr. Francis unexpectedly called her. When she asked how he got her number, Dr. Francis said he got it from someone in the department, which wasn't difficult. They chatted for a while, and then Dr. Francis invited her to lunch. Natasha admitted that by then, she had already started to develop feelings for him, so she accepted his invitation. That day, she was scheduled to work the ward from the evening until midnight, so they arranged to meet in the early afternoon. After Natasha and Dr. Francis had lunch together, he dropped her off at the ward. It was nearly 11 p.m. when she was called to bring a suction tube to the 6th floor. Natasha volunteered to take it up. On her way back down, as she reached the 5th floor landing and was about to step down the stairs, she suddenly felt a hand grab her ankle. Natasha was sure she felt a hand gripping her ankle. Shocked, she lost her balance and tumbled down the stairs. The moment she hit the ground, pain shot through her back as if 1,000 needles were stabbing her. Natasha clutched her back in agony, crying out in pain until tears streamed down her face. When she regained some composure, she looked around for help. At that moment, she saw a nurse walking down the stairs. Natasha screamed for help, and the nurse looked up at her. When Natasha saw the nurse's face clearly, she was stunned. It was Alice. Alice stopped walking and stood there looking at Natasha for a moment before she indifferently walked down the stairs, leaving Natasha lying there in pain. Natasha cried and shouted for help until, after a long while, an older woman found her lying face down on the steps. The woman said she would go get help. Soon after, Natasha was taken back to her department. Fortunately, Natasha wasn't seriously injured. The senior nurses asked her how she had fallen down the stairs, but she didn't answer and just kept crying. One of the senior nurses asked if she was in a lot of pain, and Natasha replied, "It's not that painful, but I'm heartbroken. How can someone be so heartless?" Hearing this, the senior nurses asked, "Who was heartless?" Natasha decided to tell them about what had happened and asked if they knew a nurse named Alice. When she mentioned Alice's name, the senior nurses looked at each other uneasily. Before anyone could say anything, an urgent case came in, and they had to go to work, leaving only one senior nurse to continue talking to Natasha. 2 years ago, Alice used to work here and was dating a young doctor. Everyone knew they were a couple. However, the doctor was very flirtatious, which often led to arguments between them. One day, the cleaning lady at their residence told the nurses that she heard loud arguing from an apartment on the 8th floor. The next morning, someone found a nurse lying face down on the lawn beside the building, her arms and legs twisted unnaturally, and her body covered in blood. That nurse was Alice. Authorities suspected that Alice had jumped from the building, as she had a history of depression. The spot where Alice fell was right under the area where Natasha had sat and eaten lunch earlier. Upon hearing this, the dark figure of Alice that Natasha saw on her first day came vividly to her mind, sending chills down her spine. The senior nurse continued, "That's why I warned you not to sit there. Many people have seen Alice's spirit, but I was afraid you wouldn't believe in such things and think I was just making it up to scare you." Natasha didn't need to respond. She simply showed the senior nurse her arm, where the hair was standing on end, clearly conveying that she believed every word. Natasha then asked, "Why would Alice want to hurt me?" The senior nurse leaned in and whispered, "Ever since Alice died, it seems her spirit has been haunting anyone who gets involved with that young doctor." At that moment, Natasha looked into the senior nurse's eyes, and the nurse, as if reading her mind, said, "Yes, Dr. Francis." After her shift, Natasha hurried back to her room, took a shower, took some medication, and went straight to bed. That night, she kept thinking about the story the senior nurse had told her, especially the parting words, "If you're not serious about Dr. Francis, just keep it casual. As for Alice's ghost, I don't know if it's real or not, but what's scarier is Dr. Francis's womanizing." Natasha tossed and turned for a while, then spoke out loud to herself, "Alice, I promise I won't get involved with Dr. Francis anymore, so please don't harm me. I'll try to make merit for you as much as I can." That night, Natasha eventually fell asleep, but was awakened later by the sound of thunder outside. She got up and saw heavy rain pouring down. She went to close the window that was slightly open, but suddenly heard a door slam loudly. Startled, she clutched her chest and ran to check the hallway. After scanning the area and not noticing any movement, she turned on the hallway light and saw her roommate's door ajar. Natasha called out to her roommate from the doorway but received no reply. She peeked inside and found the room empty. She thought perhaps the door slam was her roommate leaving, but then remembered her roommate was on duty until morning. She checked the door and cautiously stepped out onto the balcony. As Natasha looked around, she started hearing noises like people arguing. Driven by curiosity, she walked along the balcony. When she reached the stairwell, she saw shadows of two people disappearing upstairs. She hurried up to see what was happening, hearing fragments of the argument. "Are you serious? Are you serious?" Natasha crept from the 6th floor where she lived up to the 8th floor, the top floor. She saw that the door leading to the rooftop was open. She stood hesitantly on the 8th floor balcony, debating whether to go up. Suddenly, from the corner of her eye, she saw something white outside the balcony. Natasha quickly turned to look and saw a person in white falling past the balcony where she stood. What she saw left Natasha in a state of shock. She stood there, hands covering her mouth in disbelief. Once she regained her composure, she leaned over the railing to look down. She tried to peer into the darkness below, but the heavy rain and the darkness made it impossible to see anything. At that moment, something unexpected happened. The power went out, plunging the entire building into darkness. Suddenly, her surroundings were enveloped in pitch blackness, interrupted only by the occasional flash of lightning. Each flash illuminated the eerie atmosphere of the balcony. In one of these flashes, she glimpsed the shadowy figure of someone standing at the far end of the hallway. At that moment, Natasha understood what it felt like to be paralyzed by fear. Her arms and legs felt numb and unresponsive. Her eyes were fixed on the darkness, as if mesmerized. Then, another lightning flash revealed the figure of a woman with shoulder-length hair standing just 3 meters in front of her. When Natasha saw the woman's face clearly, she recognized her as Alice, dressed in a blood-stained nurse's uniform. What was even more terrifying was that Alice's limbs were twisted and deformed. Suddenly, Natasha heard Alice's voice talking in her ear. "I died up there." Natasha screamed at the top of her lungs in terror, and then she suddenly woke up on her bed, drenched in sweat, and thought to herself, "Was I dreaming just now?" The dream felt incredibly real, like she had just escaped from a horror movie. Glancing at the window, she saw that it was drizzling outside. She reassured herself, thinking she must have been overthinking the story about Alice. In the days following that night, Natasha tried to avoid meeting Dr. Francis. Even when he called her, she refused to answer. If he called the department, she would tell him she was busy. One evening, Dr. Francis waited for her as she got into the elevator. Natasha had nowhere to escape. In the elevator, she tried to smile and engage in normal conversation. They chatted a bit, and then Dr. Francis handed her a paper bag, saying he had bought something for her. Natasha accepted it and thanked him politely. When she opened the bag later, she found it contained clothes. When she arrived at the ward, she placed the bag of clothes that the doctor had given her on the table and then resumed her work. That day, there was a patient whose condition was not very good, as indicated by the low oxygen levels on the monitor. Natasha proceeded to suction the patient's phlegm and monitor their condition until it started to improve. Afterward, she walked out, and as she was passing the bed next to the patient's, the elderly woman lying there suddenly smiled at her. Natasha remembered that this elderly woman had been unable to move for several days, but today she seemed much better. So, Natasha went over to talk to her, saying something like, "How are you doing, Grandma? You look much stronger today." The elderly woman smiled and nodded in response. Just as Natasha was about to turn away, the woman said, "You look a bit gloomy, dear. Make sure to do some good deeds." This remark startled Natasha. She turned back and asked, "Really?" The elderly woman then advised her, "I've seen many people who look as gloomy as you. Most of them are either unlucky or being tormented by past deeds. In severe cases, it could even be life-threatening. It would be wise to find some time for meditation to help alleviate the severity of it." Natasha admitted to herself that, given everything she had experienced recently, she was starting to believe in these things. She thanked the elderly woman and went back to the room to take a rest. Natasha sat down to talk about her troubles with the senior nurses and asked if anyone knew of a temple nearby where she could go for meditation retreats. The senior nurses suggested various temples and asked Natasha why she suddenly wanted to practice meditation at a temple. She then explained to them, "After going through these experiences, I don't feel at ease. Part of me wants to make merit for Alice. Plus, just now, the elderly woman in bed 14 mentioned that I looked gloomy and advised me to make merit or meditate, hoping it might make things better." Some time passed and a new case came in. After being informed of the patient's history, the stretcher bearer wheeled the new case in, and Natasha helped slide the patient onto the bed. Once the patient was settled, she looked at the headboard and saw that it was bed number 14. Puzzled, Natasha turned to ask the assistant in the ward where the elderly woman who used to be in that bed had gone and when she had been moved. The assistant told her that the elderly woman had passed away that afternoon. Hearing this, Natasha was stunned for a moment before quickly walking back to her resting room, where she sat silently, not speaking to anyone. At midnight, Natasha finished her shift as usual. She walked out of the building with the bag of clothes that Dr. Francis had given her. As she walked towards her accommodation, she glanced at the back of the building where she had once had lunch. For some reason, she felt compelled to walk there absent-mindedly. She placed the bag of clothes on the bench next to a pillar and said, "Alice, Dr. Francis bought these clothes for you." After saying this, she quickly walked away without looking back. After that day, Natasha took leave from work to attend a meditation retreat at a forest temple nearby. When she returned to work a few weeks later, she heard the news that Dr. Francis was now dating a new nurse who had just transferred in. This news made it much easier for her to move on from him. Since her meditation retreat, Natasha hadn't experienced any strange occurrences. However, one night, after finishing her shift and returning to her accommodation, she felt like she might be coming down with something. She quickly showered, took some medicine, and went to bed. While she was in a half-asleep state, she heard a voice whispering in her ear, "Wake up! If you don't wake up, someone else will die." The voice startled Natasha awake, and she sat up in bed, groggy and confused. At that moment, she heard someone dragging something up the stairs. Since her room was adjacent to the stairwell, the sound was especially loud. Natasha's immediate thought was, "Is it Alice again?" She wondered if, despite her efforts to make merit for Alice, the spirit was still seeking vengeance. Frustrated and irritated by the noise, especially in her unwell state, Natasha got up from her bed and went to the bathroom to splash water on her face, making sure she wasn't dreaming again like before. Then, she opened her room door and stepped out onto the hallway balcony. The atmosphere was eerily similar to that night in her dream, except the lights hadn't gone out this time. At that moment, Natasha didn't know where her courage came from, but it made her bold enough to decide to walk up to the 8th floor. It was as if something compelled her to head toward the rooftop door without any reason. After she reached the door, she slowly peeked out to look at the rooftop and noticed 2 security guards struggling to drag a heavy-looking sack. Natasha watched in curiosity, hidden from view. After a while, the 2 security guards managed to pull something out of the sack. Natasha squinted to see what it was. As the security guards pulled the sack out completely, it revealed a woman's body dressed in a nurse's uniform, unconscious and unresponsive. Seeing this, Natasha quickly and quietly returned to her room, securely locking the door behind her. She immediately called the police and then contacted a senior nurse in her department, informing her that she had seen the 2 security guards doing something suspicious on the rooftop. Not long after, 3 senior nurses came to her room along with the 2 security guards. Natasha quickly led everyone up to the rooftop, and it was exactly as she had feared. The scene before them showed the 2 security guards she had seen earlier sexually assaulting the unconscious nurse. Within moments, the police officers that Natasha had called arrived just in time. After the officers apprehended the 2 predatory security guards, Natasha and the others coordinated to get help for the unconscious nurse. That night, Natasha asked to stay overnight in the senior nurse's room because she was still deeply shaken by what she had witnessed. As a result of the incident, Natasha became a key witness who had to provide a statement to the police. After the case was concluded, Natasha later learned that the 2 guards confessed to attempting to rape the nurse. Even more shocking, Further investigation by the police revealed that these same guards had previously raped Alice and staged her death to look like a suicide by throwing her body off the building.